In today's video, I'll take you behind the scenes on how I shot this autumnal mushroom image. I actually took this while out on a photo shoot for a car, but on my downtime, I wandered through the forest with my camera and found this little guy in the undergrowth. I had to get down low and needed to use focus stacking to get the mushroom itself nice and sharp. Let's dive in. So we're starting over here in Lightroom with this super exciting image of the mushroom with my hand in the picture. Why is my hand in the picture? Well, whenever you're doing any kind of stack, whether it be a focus stack like this or an exposure stack, it really helps to bookmark your images in Lightroom by taking a picture of your hand at the beginning and end. That way, when you're looking at your pictures, I know there's only these images in between those two that I actually want to use. So I had to take this image upside down because the mushroom itself was so low in the grass I couldn't get my tripod down enough. So I was able to take out the center column, flip it upside down, and then shoot with my camera much lower to the ground. It does mean that everything comes out upside down, but it's very easy just to flip it back around. But the reason I'm doing a focus stack on this shot is that, as you can see, my focus is very, very narrow, and I like that look on everything else. I like the out of focus foliage we've got around the sides of the frame, but I do want all of the mushroom to be in focus. So even though these blades or frills, whatever, are nicely in focus, it fades very, very quickly into out of focus on the edge. And of course we can see here, there we go, that the center stalk of the mushroom is out of focus, and this smaller mushroom is also out of focus. But what I did as I was taking these shots is just move that focus wheel, focusing on different parts of a shot. As we can see, this one, the little mushroom is in shot, and here we've got the center stalk. Once I had those, you take them into layers in Photoshop, and that kind of brings us to where I am now. My layers have been loaded on the right down here, and I've renamed them so I know exactly which bit it is. We've got front frill, the front middle, back, and the stalk, and then one for the small mushroom as well. Now I decided to use the small mushroom as my actual base main image because I really liked how the out of focusness, does that really work as a word? Let's say it does. I really like how that looks on this shot. But basically what we can see I've done is, once I've kind of worked out which bit of the mushroom I want to keep in focus, I've applied a layer and working my way up, I have painted in just the area of that image that I want to be in focus. And because I named this back, as in back of the cap and the stalk, I was able just to paint in that bit of the mushroom, bringing it in focus. And then I've done the same thing with middle and frill. That adds in that slice of focus. Front middle adds in that bit. Front frill adds in that front bit nicely in focus. As you can see already, all of that mushroom now, with the exception of some of the extreme edges, which I'm fine with, is fully in focus. Then we add it back in. We get that lovely blend now of excellent depth of field around here, the lovely bokeh in the background, and all this out of focus foliage around the front. The mushroom itself is pin sharp front to back, as is the stalk, as is this extra little mushroom down here. So we get the best of both worlds. So now all the focus is taken care of. What I'm going to do is I'm going to go to layer, and I'm going to go to flatten image. Now that is just going to flatten everything down into a single file from which I can start my main editing. Now, if I was working on maybe a commercial project or something where I knew I may need to sort of make revisions on it, I wouldn't flatten the image. I would work more with layers in order to let me to go back and refine any of that masking should I need to. But this is just for me. It's just for like a little arty piece, and I really like how this looks so far. So I don't want to keep all that extra layer information. It's going to make my file sizes bigger. It's going to slow my computer down. This is just a better way of working. Now, obviously, because I've aligned these layers, they weren't exactly positioned. When I was taking the shot, we have got this white outline. So I'm straight away going to crop in, not at 16:9. I'm going to keep the original ratio. I'm just going to bring that in on all sides, just to make sure that we don't have any of that white remaining. That looks great. delete cropped pixels. So usually I leave delete cropped pixels unchecked. The reason being is if you do a particular crop, so you want to go ahead and do like a 16:9 crop or something that really changes the look of the image, by not deleting those cropped pixels, you can go back and redo that crop later. However, because I'm just getting rid of this excess bit of white on the edge, I know that I don't want to go back and do anything with that, so I'm happy to delete cropped pixels, and again, that's just keeping the file size down. So there we go. Here now is our base image from which all the other edits can be applied. And if we zoom in, we can see that, yep, that mushroom is really nice and sharp and everything else is looking good. Before I do anything, there are a couple of little bits that I just want to clean up. Now, nature is nature, and I tend not to do much actual cleaning up and removal of anything in nature unless there's a particular distracting element. But there is just a couple of little blobs of dirt on the top of the mushroom that I just would like to take care of just by dotting my way using the spot removal tool across the top. It's not important really, but I just found those couple of little dots a little distracting, and so I'd just like to clean the top up. When I was actually at the scene, there was also a dead leaf that had just fallen on top of it, and I just picked that off just to clean it up. There are these other little bits, but I actually quite like those. They look like they are maybe some gnarled part of the mushroom itself. Down here as well, there's a couple of little bits. So I'm just going to get rid of those, and same here. That just gives us a cleaner starting point. Cool. Zoom back out. Okay, there we go. That has made probably very little difference whatsoever, but I think it just makes me a little bit happier going forwards. Looking at everything else, there's nothing major that I think I would want to remove. Usually the things I'll look out for is anything that really kind of draws the eye in the scene. So particularly in nature and landscapes, you know, if you see anything that's like maybe someone's dropped a piece of rubbish, or you know, there's a can or a bottle in the background of your shot, you can take that out. Anything man-made, you know, if there's a sign, I try and take those out a little bit, but this is an all-natural scene. I like these little water droplets, for example. I don't want to do anything with those. I like the dead wood and leaves down the bottom of the scene. Nothing else to me really stands out as distracting, so I'm very happy just to move straight on. So what I'm going to do first, I'm going to duplicate that background layer, and I'm going to go into Camera Raw Filter. This is bringing up basically the exact same controls you will have in Lightroom, except that it's in Photoshop. Most of my work, I think, is going to be using this Camera Raw module because this is a very, very nice scene. It's already a very even exposure. I don't need to do anything major to it. But I do want to just start by bringing that temperature up a little bit. Not very much, because if you start to go too far, then it gets very warm very quickly. And I actually quite like the slightly cooler nature, but it's a bit too cool. So I'm going to bring it up just to, I think +4 is really all it needs. What about the tint? If you go too far, it gets very purple. Too far the other way, it's a sickly green. I think a little bit into that magenta, but again, just a very, very small amount. I think even +2 is enough. When I'm doing a shot that's really more for my own personal collection, just an artistic shot rather than anything editorial or commercial, I like to have a play around with the sliders just to kind of see the different sorts of effects I will get. And usually that will involve sort of just bringing down the highlights all the way to the bottom and then putting them all the way to the top and kind of seeing whereabouts I like that more. And certainly in this one, you bring the highlights right down. Everything's very flat. This all starts looking weird in the sky in the background. Not very good at all. I actually prefer taking those a little bit further. And same with shadows. Bring those up, bring those down. And in this instance, I actually find bringing them down really draws the eye to the mushroom in the middle because there's not a lot of shadow detail there. So by bringing that down, you can see it forms a more natural vignette with all this foliage, and that starts to go down. Bring it right up, and suddenly everything is bright, and your eye doesn't know where to go in the frame. I don't want to go overboard on this because I may end up adding my own vignette later. So I'm thinking maybe somewhere around the -20 mark looks pretty good. The whites again, we can play with those up and down, up just a little bit, adds a little bit more punch and contrast. Particularly pay attention to the top of the mushroom. What happens when we bring that up? Just starts to get a little bit more vibrancy on it, which I quite like. So I'm going to keep that as, I think, plus 15 looks good to me. The blacks I'm not going to do with, because once you bring this black down, as you can see, it falls into blackness very, very quickly, and going up again start to bring in too much detail. So I'm going to leave that exactly where it is. Clarity and dehaze I don't want to do anything with, because I think this is a shot that doesn't require the sort of punch that you will get from those sliders. It's a very soft autumnal shot, and you start bringing up the clarity, everything goes very crunchy, and I don't think that suits this scene at all. If anything, we could bring them down, but for the moment I want to keep all of that crispness on the mushroom. If we start to bring it down, you can see everything goes very soft. It may be that I apply some negative clarity selectively to the rest of the scene and I mask it out, but I'm going to come to that later on. Same with dehaze. If I bring that down, it starts to lighten the scene, and if we bring it up, it gets a little bit too crunchy. So I'm going to leave that at, I may even just go +1. So that's some very basic adjustments so far. I want to have a very quick look into the HSL adjustments. I want to play around with the hues a little bit first, particularly with the greens, because it is looking a little bit too sort of forest green, and I want to bring in a little bit more of the orange tones to really give that autumnal effect. So I'm going to just start by pulling that green a little bit more to the left. Again, I don't want to go the whole way, because then everything becomes a bit of a orangey mess. I want to keep some green, but just not quite that emeraldy green that we had before. So I'm going to keep that maybe -20. And the HSL tabs is again one that I really like playing around with, just bringing them up and down and seeing what different effects you can get. Obviously with the yellow hue, if you bring it right down to the bottom, everything's a very weird orange, particularly on the mushroom, and again too far to the top, very, very nasty. So in this one I actually want to leave it right bang in the middle. And I think same with the orange. In fact, actually the orange I think can stand, particularly because the way it affects the top of the mushroom on these little nodules. Bring it down just a touch, I think, just helps boost that colour. And going a little bit more into the deep orange separates it from the background, which is a little bit more yellowy. So I like that at about -9. I think that works well so far. Now we can play with the luminance a bit. And again, I like to sort of bring it up and down, see what I like. Green's up. Maybe the yellow's up as well, because I like what it's doing here, just bringing out a little bit of that background. When it's right down to the bottom, it just sort of falls into nothing. Further up, we get a bit more interest going on. Sorry, I'm not good on the terminology today, but, you know, there we are. The orange as well, I like bringing that up for luminance. Not too much, just about there. I like what it's doing to the top of the mushroom, but I don't want to go overboard at this point, because I'm going to be using the dodge and burn tool later, and I may want to bring some more detail out on the top using that. So I don't want to go overboard with the HSL just yet. But that's it for most of my main adjustments right now. So I'm going to go ahead and click OK and commit those changes. And if we just flick this on and off, we can see the difference that's already made. It's warming the image up. It's bringing down those shadows that draws the eye more towards the mushroom in the middle, and I think just those few tweaks is made a huge amount of difference to this shot. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to copy that again, and now I'm going to go back into Camera Raw filter, but this time I'm actually going to start working with some of the presets that I have installed. These come from Visco. They're excellent presets. I use them often, but what I don't like to do is use them in Lightroom, where you only get the option of just applying the preset or not applying it. There isn't really much of a mid-ground. Well, actually, I tell a lie. These ones actually do come as a full preset, or there's a half-applied version. But even the half-applied version is often far too much for me. And I find by working with it in Photoshop, by creating a new layer, then I can dial in only the amount of toning that I want. And again, working with presets in this way is a great way just to flick through and play with different ideas, particularly, again, for this sort of artistic personal shot where you just want to see what you can achieve. It's not about hitting a very specific brief. You're not trying to capture a car or a product or a person in true to life detail to sell a product. You're just having a play around, and that's when I think presets really come into their own, because you can flick through and just take inspiration from the different styles that you're seeing. So having just flicked down to A9 RAW, I love the toning that this is doing. I'll just flick on and off. We can see that those greens are again being brought a little bit more into a more muted tone, which I think just helps to bring the eye more towards the mushroom in the middle. I love what this is doing. Now, I actually somehow managed to get rid of A9 half, but that's fine, because what I'm going to do is I'm going to click it, I'm going to press OK. Now we can see it's applied it, but because it's only applied it to this one layer, I can then use the opacity and bring that right down, and then we just start to build it back up just to the point where I want it. And I think somewhere around 60 looks good. If we start to go too far, then yeah, we start to go too contrasty, too much of that effect is being applied. I think 60% was a really good point. So now if we flick it on and off, obviously that preset is very much having an effect, but it's not quite as strong as it was before. The great thing I like about doing this is that I can then press Command E, merge my adjustments, copy that layer, and then go back into Camera Raw filter and then apply another one over the top. So you can switch up how you use your toning by applying presets on top of each other. And that's not something you can do in Lightroom. It's not something you can normally do with presets, but by using Photoshop layers in this way, you can create some really interesting looks. So again, now I've applied that first one, I just go back through and I see what the other ones look like. And actually, A5 RAW adds a lot of blues and purples into the shadows, and I think for this it adds a really, really nice effect if we just look at that on and off. But I already know that this is going to be way too much, so I'm going to apply the half version, A5 RAW, obviously very, very blue all over. I'm going to click OK, and immediately I'm going to bring the opacity right down to 0, and I'm going to build that up slowly just until we start to see a bit more of that blue depth in those shadows. And I think at 50% this time is a good point. We take that on and off. So it's not really doing much to the actual color toning of the mushroom. It's really just applying to these leaves. I actually think maybe a little bit less. Maybe we'll just go to 40 on this. Yeah, I think 40 is good. Maybe actually 35. 33 apparently. I think that's better. It's a much more subtle look. It's just that little bit, particularly around the edges, where it brings in those extra tones into those shadows, and I think really helps turn this into a more beautiful cinematic image. So now I'm going to merge those layers so that all our adjustments are sitting on this one layer. And if we just click that on and off, we can see the huge amount of difference that using those multiple different presets has actually made to the image overall. And what's great is that using any one of those presets individually wouldn't give you this effect. It's only by layering them up, changing the opacity, then you get the result that we see here. But that isn't everything we want to do. I do want to do some dodging and burning to the scene, and I'm going to do that by creating a new empty layer. I'm going to go to Edit, Fill, and I want to fill it with 50% gray. And then if I click on the blend mode and I click to overlay, you'll see that that disappears, because overlay means that anything which is just in the mid gray disappears. What that means is that if we get a brush and then start painting on in black, suddenly it gets darker. Similarly, if we paint with white, it gets lighter. Now, obviously, right now I'm at 100% opacity on the brush and 100% flow, so these are extreme examples, but it gives you an idea of what we can achieve. So I'm going to undo both of those. I'm going to zoom in a little bit, and I'm going to get my brush back, and I know that first I want to paint with black to darken some parts of the scene. I want a larger size, something around that is good. I want it to be as soft as possible, But also, as you saw before, that was a very extreme example. So I'm going to bring the opacity down to 13% and the flow right down to probably about the same. I do just want to bring down the edge of the mushroom a little bit because it is a little bit dark. Same, no, it's a little bit bright rather. And I want to do the same on this side. I did notice that my strength was a little bit too bright, so I'm just going to, I've brought that down to just 4%, and I'm going to just brush that in here. Click on and off. We can just see it's brought some of that highlight down a touch. But now I want to start using it a bit more creatively. So I'm going to bring the brush back. Again, same size, same everything. I want to brush in onto the side of this just to emphasize that shadow. And click that on and off. Big difference there. Same again with the shadow on the mushroom itself. I'm going to bring that in, make it a lot more obvious. Same again down here. Just by going over and over again, you just build up that tone. It's definitely the safest way to do it, by using a very low opacity and a low flow, because then you can just build it up and it looks a lot more natural. If you just started trying to paint on in, let's say 58%, then you see how strong it is. It's very difficult to make that look natural. So it's all about very, very small adjustments each time, building it up and getting it to where you want it to be. Now I'm going to zoom right in. I'm going to use a much smaller brush this time, and I'm just going to go in between some of these nodules, just trying to accent them just a little bit. Now when we get in super close, we can see that my focus stacking hasn't been completely accurate, but this is a very pixel peeping level of zoomed in, and as I say, if it was for a client or a commercial shoot, you'd want to make sure that was absolutely spot on. But for me in this, it's absolutely fine. Like, I'm not sharing this image at absolute full resolution. It's probably just going to be mostly on Facebook and Twitter. And for that, this is absolutely spot on. So I'm just going round, and anything that is already darker, I'm just trying to accent that a little bit. I'm going to do the same in between these blades. Is it blades? I don't know anything about mushrooms. I don't even like to eat them. Are these blades, or are these frills or vents? I don't know what you'd call this technically. They look like blades, so I'm going with blades. But as you can see, in between each of them there is already a shadow, and I just want to accent that a little bit more using this tool. If we just flick that on and off, we can see the difference that that's making. I am doing this quite quickly as well. If you were doing this for a very special job, you'd probably want to zoom in closer, use a smaller brush, maybe use a graphics tablet so you get a bit more fine grain control over your cursor, and you'd want to take the time to do it properly. But for me right now, this is fine. I am going to zoom in a bit more, slightly smaller brush. As you see, I've swapped over the colors, so now I'm painting with white, and I'm just doing the edges, right the tips of these blades, to just bring back some of that crisp detail. I'm going to bring my opacity up a little bit more. Just like this. It's really not making a huge difference. It just carves out the textures on this mushroom a little bit more, and it's probably not an effect you'd ever really look at and go, oh yes, I can see what's been done there, but it just makes a very subtle difference, which can transform an image from just being okay to being a bit more dramatic, having a bit more impact. Let's zoom back out. If we click on and off, it's definitely making a bit of difference, but I can do a little bit more. I want to brighten up the other side of this mushroom, because obviously we've darkened one side where that shadow is. I want to go and do the same again. I'm going to bring a bigger brush back, and we're just going to paint in. Because we can see this is already where the sun is hitting it, this spot here. So we're not changing the lighting. All we're doing is just accenting what's already there. This bottom frill, and maybe a little bit down its stalk as well. And I'm going to do the same on the stalk of the mushroom, and around on this frill, and a little bit on this side. Okay. So it definitely has made a difference. I'm not entirely sure it's a difference that I particularly like. I think we've lost a little bit of contrast over here. If we turn that on, this suddenly goes a little bit flatter. I don't really think I like that. I think my efforts to bring down that exposure, I actually don't think is great. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to apply a layer mask to that. I'm just going to go ahead and paint it out with black, slightly higher opacity, and I'm just going to paint that out, what we've just done, just on that little bit, and maybe a little bit around the edge. Just brings that highlight back in. The rest I think looks great, particularly down in these fins or blades, and on the mushroom itself. Like, I like that accented shadow. Yeah, just a very small tweak just to make that happen, but I think we're looking good. But before I move on from the dodging and burning, I do just want to do some extra dodging and burning around the sides. So I've gone back to the dodge and burn layer, I've selected black, and I'm using a much bigger brush this time. In fact, I'm going to go even bigger, right up to 1,000 pixels. And I'm just going to brush in a little bit, my computer's very slow, on some of these highlights around here, where it might be drawing the eye ever so slightly. This is going to help bring the attention back to the mushroom in the middle. Okay, so that is pretty much everything that I want to do in Photoshop. If we just go back and have a look at our original background layer, that's the one we've got after we focus stacked the layer and just did that little bit of cropping. And then that's what we managed to bring from this. I think this is a really cool looking shot. It's certainly very, very autumnal, and those effects that we've applied using those various presets has created a much more cinematic and artistic look to this scene. So I'm very happy with that. The last thing I'm going to do though is I'm just going to press Command S, save. It'll take a little while. That'll take us back into Lightroom. So there we go, back in Lightroom with this shot, and I'm going to go back into the Develop tab. I'm just going to zoom in, and I'm going to use an adjustment brush just to bring down some highlights just a little bit, just on that rim again. So as you can see, we pull that down too much. Doesn't look good, but it is just a little bit too bright for me, so I want to bring it down just to -15, keeps everything in line. Looks good. And you can have a little bit more of a play with some of these sliders, bring the shadows down even more. It's actually not looking bad. And I could also just play around with the white balance again, knowing that it's over the top of those effects that we've already applied. I think maybe bringing it just by a little bit. And same goes, I think, for that magenta. The absolute last thing that I just want to try in Lightroom is adding a bit of a light flare coming in, because sometimes that can help really warm up an image. I don't like doing it very often because, particularly in an image like this, there isn't a light flare. So adding one in is very much that sort of Photoshop trickery, which, you know, is fine. It's not, I don't really enjoy doing it too much, particularly not on a natural scene, but I wanted to give it a little go. So I'm going to bring in that circle of light, if you are going to do this, you need to bear in mind a couple of things to keep it natural. The main thing being the direction of light. So if I put this in over here, and what I'm doing to create this is making a big radial filter. I'm going to feather it as much as possible, right it to 100, and upping the exposure, and then upping the warmth to give it that warm glow. Now, if I left that here, the problem is that it's casting down this side of the mushroom, but the shadow is on the left side. So this light doesn't make any sense at all. In order for it to make sense, it needs to be over here, probably fairly far away, casting down like this. And you can tweak it a little bit. You can up and down the highlights. I think keep it down there. Up that exposure a little bit more. Maybe even bring that tab out to give it a bit more spread. And I think if we just turn that on and off, it's quite a nice look. Again, not realistic because it wasn't really there, but at least it fits with the mushroom. We do have those bright highlights on top already, and we do have the shadow here. So at least this, as a light source, makes sense. But what it has done now is slightly blown out the highlights on the mushroom itself. So I'm going to go back in and I'm going to just bring those highlights back down to keep it controlled as it was before. Okay. So now hopefully that radial filter we put in, isn't really doing too much harm to the mushroom itself. Great. So I'll say that this is the finished image, and it is one that I am really quite pleased with, particularly because I wasn't actually going to shoot this in the first place. I just happened to find this while I was on a different shoot and thought it would make a good image. And if we have a look at one of the before and after shots, we can see that there is a huge amount of difference between what we shot on location and then what we've managed to achieve here using Photoshop and Lightroom. As I say, these edits are sometimes a little bit more extreme than I would normally do for this kind of thing, and certainly putting in that radial filter makes that not exactly the most honest image, but I just wanted to show you the sort of thing that you can do just to help boost that dramatic feel in your autumnal shots. But hopefully you've enjoyed this video, you found some of my tips useful. If you have, please do make sure to hit the like button, subscribe if you don't already, and I will see you next time.